Most people, when they think about a power outage, think about candles. They think about finding a flashlight in a drawer, or calling a neighbour to ask if their electricity is out too. The assumption is that it ends, that somewhere a utility worker flips a switch and within hours or days the lights come back on. This assumption is so deeply embedded in modern thinking that almost no one questions it. And that is exactly where the problem begins. The question we rarely ask is not what happens when the power goes out. The question is what happens when it stays out. What happens when the outage is not measured in hours or days but in months? What happens when it crosses the threshold of a full year, 365 days without electricity? Not as a thought experiment. As a real, technically plausible event, this is not a story about the apocalypse. It is a calm, methodical examination of what a prolonged power outage would actually look like, what it would require from individuals, from communities, from governments, and from the global systems that quietly underpin everything we take for granted. Let us begin where the disruption would actually begin, not in your home, not in your neighbourhood. The cascade starts in the infrastructure, specifically in the grid. The electrical grid is one of the most complex engineered systems in human history. It is a layered network of generation plants, transmission lines, substations and transformers, all synchronized in real time, all dependent on each other in ways that are not always visible to the people who use it. When a large portion of that network fails simultaneously, the effect is not a dimmer switch being turned down. It is more like a tightly wound clock spring snapping all at once. Within the first hour, most of the affected region has lost power entirely. And this is where the real story begins. At first, this seems manageable. People check their phones, which still have battery charge. They open their refrigerators, remember they should keep them closed and close them again. Utility companies begin receiving reports. The assumption, the deeply held assumption, is that this is a big outage. A bad one, but a fixable one. That assumption, for a year-long event, is not correct. The first thing to understand is why a year-long outage is different in kind, not just in degree, from a week-long outage. The difference lies in the nature of industrial supply chains. The transformers that form the backbone of the high-voltage transmission grid are not commodity items. A large power transformer takes between 12 and 18 months to manufacture. It weighs hundreds of tons and requires precision components made in very few facilities worldwide. So here is the first hard fact. If enough of those transformers are damaged simultaneously, the grid cannot be repaired quickly. Not because engineers lack the knowledge, but because the industrial capacity to manufacture replacement parts simply does not exist at the scale and speed required. This is a consequence of just-in-time manufacturing, global supply chains, and economic optimization stretching back decades. Zoom out for a moment. If the event affects multiple countries simultaneously, every nation capable of manufacturing these components is also experiencing the outage. Their factories are dark. Their supply lines are interrupted. The mutual aid agreements between utility companies are stretched to breaking point. By the end of the first day, the situation is already becoming complicated in ways most people have not thought about. Running water in a modern city is not gravity-fed. It is pump-fed. Water treatment plants use electric pumps. Distribution systems use electric pumps. Sewage treatment plants use electric pumps. Within 24 hours of a grid failure, urban water pressure begins to drop. Within a week, most modern urban water systems have lost functional pressure. This is the point at which the outage stops being an inconvenience and starts being a crisis. Most people focus on the obvious impact of no electricity. No lights, no internet, no television. But these are not the survival-critical impacts. The survival-critical impacts run underneath the visible ones. Water is the first of these invisible dependencies. Most urban populations have enough stored water for roughly 3 to 5 days at subsistence levels. Beyond that, rivers, streams and rainwater become necessary. But within 2 weeks of a large-scale outage, the water quality in urban waterways begins to deteriorate significantly, because the pumping stations that normally prevent sewage from backing up into streets and rivers are also offline. Hospitals have backup generators. This is true, and it matters in the first days. But backup generators run on diesel fuel, and diesel must be replenished. A large hospital might have a supply sufficient for 3 to 5 days. Some better prepared facilities might have 2 weeks. The assumption built into hospital backup power design is that grid power will be restored before the fuel runs out. For a year-long event, this assumption does not hold. Within 2 to 3 weeks, hospitals are rationing generator fuel. Non-essential systems go offline first, but patients who depend on powered medical devices, ventilators, dialysis machines, infusion pumps, are in a situation that has no comfortable resolution in a world without electricity. A person in renal failure who depends on dialysis needs treatment 3 times per week. Without it, survival is measured in days to weeks. This is not stated for dramatic effect. It is stated because it reveals how hidden dependencies in complex systems can make physical assets, buildings, equipment, trained staff completely inert without continuous power. By the end of the first month, the character of the crisis has changed fundamentally. Food supply chains begin showing stress around week 3. A significant portion of the modern food supply depends on continuous refrigeration from production to consumption. Without power, the cold chain breaks. The food does not disappear, but it spoils. Grocery stores, which typically carry 3 to 5 days of inventory, move through their stock within the first week. What is available by week 4 is what does not require refrigeration, what can be transported without complex logistics, and what is locally produced. At first, this seems like a simplified diet. Humans survived for millennia on canned goods, dried grains, and root vegetables. But transitioning to this diet in the middle of a modern city, with a population that has no experience producing or preparing such foods, and with no functioning infrastructure to distribute them, is a complex logistical and social challenge. The financial system is an early and critical casualty. Banks are not buildings with money in them. Banks are computer systems that maintain records of who owns what. Those systems run in data centers requiring enormous continuous electrical power. Within the first week, most digital payment systems stop functioning. The economy, to the extent it continues, reverts to cash and then to barter. In a barter economy operating under scarcity, the items that hold value are not the items that held value the previous week. Things with direct utility become the new currency. Food, water, medical supplies, fuel, tools, light sources, and knowledge. The person who knows how to repair a diesel engine becomes more practically valuable than the person who can write code. The person who knows how to preserve food without refrigeration becomes a community resource in a way they were not before. By the end of the 3rd month, a pattern is visible in how different communities are faring. Rural communities with direct access to food production and some experience with non-industrial agricultural methods are managing better on the material dimension. Dense urban areas face a more acute version of the same challenges. The concentration of population that was for 2 centuries a source of economic efficiency becomes a logistical liability. Many people in a small area, none of whom produce the food they eat, all dependent on supply chains that have been severely disrupted. The historical response to this situation is migration. When cities can no longer support their populations, populations move toward food and water. A town that normally houses 50,000 people and is surrounded by agricultural land suddenly becomes attractive to populations from an adjacent city of 2 million. The town does not have the infrastructure to house or feed an additional 100,000 people. Social tensions that were previously managed by institutional structures begin to emerge in more direct forms. It is tempting to default to one of 2 narratives here. Either people come together in crisis, showing the best of human nature, or they descend into violence, showing the worst. The historical record suggests reality is more complicated. In the early stages, prosocial behavior is typically dominant. People help neighbors, share resources, organize into mutual aid groups. But as weeks turn into months and the prospect of resolution becomes uncertain, the calculation of self-interest changes. Resources that were freely shared in week 1 are more carefully guarded in month 3, because the expected duration of scarcity has extended. This is not a moral failure. It is a rational response to changed information. Government functions depend on communication, and communication networks are either offline or severely degraded. Governments are making extremely difficult decisions about resource allocation with incomplete information under enormous time pressure. Law enforcement, which depends on communications and fuel, is operating at reduced capacity. Community governance structures that would have been considered informal under normal conditions, neighbourhood associations, local councils, mutual aid networks, emerge as meaningful decision-making bodies because they are present, they have local trust, and they can act without depending on infrastructure that no longer functions. By month 6, the situation has stabilised into a new difficult normal. Energy has been partially replaced by distributed low-tech alternatives. Wood is being burned for heat and cooking. Diesel generators provide limited power for critical applications. Small solar panels, which work without grid connection, are being deployed wherever they can be sourced. Even a small panel with a battery pack represents significant practical value. It can charge communication devices, provide LED lighting, run small fans. Their value in barter terms rises sharply as the outage extends. Food production has shifted toward local, seasonal, and lower energy input models. Kitchen gardens have expanded dramatically. Agricultural land under single crop industrial production is being divided into smaller plots growing a wider variety of crops. The knowledge required for small-scale diverse agriculture, which existed in older generations and was retained in agricultural communities, is being rapidly transferred. Zoom out to the global picture. Countries that have not been affected are experiencing their own secondary disruptions. The disruption to manufacturing and agriculture in the affected regions sends price shocks through global commodity markets. The cost of oil rises because refineries in the affected region are offline. Food commodity prices rise because export capacity has fallen. These economic ripple effects cause real hardship even in countries that never lost their own power. Inflation and supply shortages hit the poorest populations first, as always. By month 9, the recovery effort has made some measurable progress, but the pace has been humbling. Specialized teams have been working continuously on the most critical infrastructure nodes. Some partial grid restoration has occurred in regions near nuclear plants or large hydroelectric facilities, but patchy restoration creates islands of relative normality surrounded by areas still in darkness, generating pressure and movement toward the restored areas. Community solidarity that held through the hardest months begins to fracture along the line between those who have restored power and those who do not. By month 12, the year is complete. Not in triumph, not in resolution, but in a kind of hard-won, sober-faced continuation. The lights have not all come back on, but the situation is clearly different from month 1. Communities have adapted. New systems have been built. New social structures have formed. New economic arrangements have emerged. The year has been in education in dependencies, in the invisibility of infrastructure. The water that comes from a tap, the light that comes from a switch, the food that appears on a shelf, these are not background conditions of existence. They are outcomes of vast, complex, energy-intensive systems that require constant maintenance, constant fuel, constant human attention. When those systems fail, the work they were doing must be done by other means, or it must not be done at all. And when that previously invisible work becomes necessary to do by hand, it becomes visible. The rebuilt grid, where resources allow, is being designed with more redundancy, more distributed generation, more local storage. The rebuilt food systems include more local production and more attention to what can be grown without industrial inputs. The rebuilt financial systems are thinking more carefully about what happens when digital infrastructure goes offline. Civilizations have always been shaped by their energy systems. The transition from wood to coal, from coal to oil, from oil to electricity, was not just a change in fuel. It was a change in what was possible, what was normal, what was expected. Each transition created new capabilities and new dependencies. Each dependency created new vulnerabilities. What the year-long outage asks of us, as a civilization, is not a retreat from complexity. It is a different relationship with complexity, one that includes resilience as a design criterion alongside efficiency, one that invests in redundancy even when redundancy has no short-term return. Efficiency and resilience are, in many engineering contexts, in tension with each other. An optimized system has no slack. It is efficient. It is also brittle. A less optimized system has redundancies and buffers that look wasteful until they are the only thing that works. The communities that fared best through the year were not necessarily the wealthiest or the most technologically advanced. They were the ones that had maintained the most functional social bonds, the most practical knowledge distributed across their population, and had invested at least some attention in what happens when normal systems stop working. The power comes back on, slowly, patchily, over months. The sensation of electricity returning after a year is described as almost disorienting. A refrigerator hums. A light switch does what it is supposed to do. Ordinary moments that had been unremarkable for an entire lifetime suddenly carry an enormous weight of relief. And in that moment the opportunity exists. To remember what the year taught, to build differently, to carry forward the understanding that systems which appear permanent are in fact constructed, maintained, and vulnerable. What sits between the world with electricity and the world without it is the accumulated, daily invisible labour of a civilization keeping its infrastructure alive. That labour, like the infrastructure itself, deserves to be seen clearly.